For years, Milo, a lonely German shepherd, stretched his paws through a rusted chain, desperately longing for love. Forgotten in a desolate backyard, no one stopped, no one cared. Until one woman changed everything. What she did next will warm your heart and prove that even the most broken souls deserve a second chance. Stay tuned for Milo's incredible journey from chains to love. Milo didn't remember life before the chain. It had always been there, cold, heavy, unforgiving. It wrapped around his neck like an iron collar, digging into his skin when he moved too far. At first, he had fought against it. He had scratched, twisted, and chewed, desperate to break free, but the chain was stronger than he was, and over time he had learned there was no escape. The backyard was small and lifeless, the dirt was packed hard beneath his paws, and the grass had long since been trampled into dust. A broken wooden fence surrounded him, cutting him off from the world beyond. Sometimes he would catch glimpses of it through the cracks, flashes of color, moving shapes, shadows of a life he would never know. His food bowl sat empty more often than not, rusting under the sun. His water dish, if it was ever filled, dried up too quickly in the summer. The heat scorched his fur, and the ground beneath him burned his paws. In the winter, the cold cut through him like a knife, his body shivering against the biting wind. There was no shelter, no warmth, no comfort. Only time, endless, agonizing time. He had once been strong, he had once been proud. His body had carried muscle, his coat had been thick and full. Now his ribs pressed against his skin, his legs were weak from disuse, and his fur was dull and matted, with patches missing from where he had scratched too hard. Worse than the hunger, worse than the thirst, was the loneliness. The world beyond. The fence was full of life. He could hear it every day, children laughing, cars passing, voices rising and falling in conversation. He had once known voices like that, voices that meant love, that meant safety, but those voices never spoke to him. Sometimes, when the silence became too much to bear, he would lift his head and howl, not out of anger, not as a warning, but as a plea. A cry for someone to notice him, a cry for someone to remember he existed. But no one ever answered. Rarely did he come outside. Sometimes food would be tossed onto the ground, dry and tasteless. Other times, days would pass without anything at all. His stomach twisted in pain, his throat burned with thirst. And yet, even after everything, even after all the suffering, something inside him refused to die. He didn't know why. He only knew that every day he still crawled toward the fence, still hoped, still waited. Then one afternoon, he heard footsteps. They were different, softer, slower. He had learned not to care when people walked by. He had learned that no one ever stopped. But this time, the footsteps, a pair of shoes, and then a voice. "Oh my God!" It was a woman. His ears flicked forward. He barely had the strength to lift his head, but he did. The shoes didn't move. She was still there. For the first time in years, someone saw him. Claire stood frozen, staring through the gap in the fence. She hadn't expected to find this. She had been walking down the street, lost in her own thoughts, when something had caught her eye, a shadow, a movement, a glimpse of something stretching out from beneath the fence. Then she saw them, the paws, large, bony, covered in dirt, with patches of fur missing. They pressed against the ground as if reaching for something, for someone. And then she crouched down. That was when she saw his face. Milo lifted his head slowly, almost as if he wasn't sure if she was real. his dark eyes, sunken from hunger, locked onto hers. His ears twitched slightly, but he didn't move. He was waiting. Claire's heart clenched. How long had he been like this? How many people had walked past this fence without ever noticing him? She swallowed hard, scanning his body. Thin, too thin, his ribs pressed against his skin, his legs trembling even though he was barely holding himself up. His fur was patchy and dull, covered in dirt and old wounds. Around his neck, a thick, rusted chain kept him in place, its lengths digging into his skin. A lump formed in her throat. He had been here for a long time, alone. She reached a hand toward him, slow and careful. His ears flicked again, but he didn't pull away. Instead, he stretched his nose forward, sniffing gently. His movements were hesitant, cautious, as if he was still trying to decide if she was a dream. And then, after a long pause, he licked her fingertips. It was barely a touch, soft, weak, but it was enough to break her heart. A dog like this, one who had clearly been ignored, neglected, left to rot, should have been afraid of humans. He should have flinched away. But he didn't. Even after everything, he still wanted love. Tears burned at the corners of her eyes. She swallowed hard, standing up quickly. She needed to do something. Her hands clenched into fists as she scanned the yard, looking for any sign of life. A house sat just a few steps away, old and run down, its windows covered with dust and grime. The fence was broken in places, the yard was littered with rusted tools and trash, and Milo, forgotten, was left outside like nothing more than an afterthought. Her jaw tightened. No, she wouldn't ignore him, not like everyone else had. She pulled out her phone, her fingers shaking as she scrolled through her contacts. There had to be someone, a shelter, an animal rescue, anyone who could help. Her heart pounded in her chest. She knew that if she walked away now, he might not make it. She had to act. Claire's fingers trembled as she held her phone, scrolling through her contacts. There had to be someone, a shelter, an animal rescue, anyone who could help. But with every second that passed, her stomach tightened. What if they didn't answer? What if no one came? She looked back at Milo. He was still watching her. His ears twitched at the faint sound of her voice, but his body remained still, as if he had learned long ago that hoping was useless. A lump formed in her throat. She tried calling the nearest animal shelter first. No answer. She tried again. Nothing. Her heart pounded as she tried another number and another. No one was picking up. Her fingers clenched around the phone. She had two choices: walk away and hope someone else helped, or step in herself. She glanced at Milo again. He was still watching, still waiting. She couldn't leave without trying. She slipped her phone back into her pocket and reached for the latch on the gate. It was locked, of course. Her eyes scanned the fence, searching for another way in. It wasn't tall, but it was sturdy enough that climbing over wasn't an option. She walked along the edge of the property, looking for a weak spot, an opening, anything. And then she saw it near the back of the fence. A few old wooden boards had rotted away, leaving a gap just big enough for her to squeeze through. She hesitated for half a second before dropping to her knees, crawling through the tight space, feeling dirt and dry grass pressed against her palms. When she stood up on the other side, she finally saw him fully, not just through a gap in the fence, not just as a pair of reaching paws, but as he was, skin and bones, ribs sharp under his thin fur, legs trembling just to keep him upright. She took a slow step forward. Milo didn't move, his eyes locked onto hers, but he stayed where he was, the heavy chain around his neck holding him back. She let out a shaky breath. "Hey, buddy," she whispered. His ears twitched. She crouched down, keeping her movements slow and careful. Her fingers itched to reach out and touch him, but she knew she couldn't rush this. "You've been here a long time, haven't you?" Milo blinked slowly, and then, hesitantly, he took half a step forward. Her heart clenched. It was barely a movement, just an inch, but it was enough. It meant he hadn't given up completely. She extended her hand again, palm open. Milo sniffed the air but didn't come closer. She let him take his time. Her eyes flickered to the chain around his neck. It was thick, rusted, and far too tight. Her stomach twisted. He had probably been wearing it for years. Her hands curled into fists. How could someone do this? How could someone leave him like this, suffering in silence day after day? Her jaw tightened. This wasn't just neglect. This was cruelty. She swallowed hard and glanced toward the house. There were no lights on inside, no movement. Was anyone even home? Her pulse quickened. She wasn't sure what scared her more, that someone was inside and simply didn't care, or that he had been abandoned completely. Either way, he wasn't staying here. She looked back at him, meeting his tired eyes. "I'm getting you out of here," she whispered. For the first time, Milo's tail moved just a little, a flicker of hope. She pulled out her phone again. This time, she wasn't calling for help. She was calling the police. Claire's fingers tightened around her phone as she listened to the ringing on the other end. Each second felt agonizingly long. What if no one answered? What if help never came? Then a voice said, "911, what's your emergency?" She inhaled sharply, her chest tightening. "Hi, I need to report a case of animal neglect. A dog. He's in terrible shape. He's chained up, he's starving, and I don't think anyone has taken care of him in years." The dispatcher's tone remained calm and professional. "Can you provide the address?" Claire turned, scanning the peeling numbers on the house. She read them aloud, her voice growing more urgent. "How long has the dog been there?" "I don't know," she admitted, glancing at Milo, who remained still, his tired eyes locked onto hers. "But judging by how he looks, a long time." There was a pause, then, "I'll send an officer to check it out." Her heart pounded. "How long will that take?" "It depends on availability, but we'll try to get someone there as soon as possible." Claire ended the call and exhaled sharply. Milo hadn't moved. His body swayed slightly from exhaustion, making every second harder for him. She knelt down again, her voice soft. "They're coming. You just have to hold on a little longer." His ears flicked, but he still didn't step forward. A painful thought crossed her mind. Did he even know what freedom felt like? She stood up, scanning the yard for anything useful. She couldn't just wait. She needed to do something. The chain around his neck was thick, rusted, and far too tight. Her stomach twisted at the thought of how long he had been bound by it. She tried to loosen it, but the metal wouldn't budge. She needed something to break it. Her gaze landed on a pile of discarded tools near the back porch, bolt cutters. Her breath caught. She wasn't sure if she was allowed to do this. If the police arrived and saw her tampering with the chain, would she get in trouble? But then she looked at Milo again, at his shaking legs, at the open wounds on his neck, at the silent plea in his eyes. She had no choice. She ran toward the tools, grabbed the bolt cutters, and hurried back to him. "I'm getting you out of this," she whispered, positioning the blades around the thickest part of the chain. She took a deep breath and squeezed. The metal snapped for the first time in years. Milo was free. He didn't move at first. He just stood there, his body stiff, his muscles frozen. His eyes blinked, his ears flicked. Then, in a moment so sudden that it made Claire gasp, he collapsed. Her heart stopped. "No, no, no," she whispered, rushing forward. He wasn't unconscious, but his body had gone limp, his breathing shallow. She realized then that he didn't know what to do. He had been in chains for so long that his body didn't know how to react without them. Tears blurred her vision as she reached for him, her hands running gently over his fur. "You're okay," she whispered. "You're free." The distant sound of sirens told her that help was finally coming. She just hoped it wasn't too late. The sirens grew louder, echoing through the empty street. Claire barely noticed the flashing lights as a patrol car pulled up, followed closely by an animal control vehicle. Milo was still lying on the ground, his breathing slow and shallow. She stayed beside him, one hand resting gently on his back, hoping he could feel even the smallest bit of warmth. The car door slammed, and 2 officers stepped out, followed by an animal control worker holding a medical bag. Claire stood up quickly, her heart racing. "He's been like this for years," she stammered. "He's starving. His chain was too tight. And I think—" She swallowed hard. "I think he just gave up." The officer closest to her gave a slow nod. His gaze shifted to Milo, taking in the sharp outline of his ribs, the raw skin beneath where the chain had rubbed his fur away. "Jesus," he muttered under his breath. The animal control worker knelt beside Milo, checking his breathing and his heart rate. "Weak, but he's holding on," she said, her voice calm but urgent. She turned to the officer. "We need to get him to the shelter's vet clinic. He doesn't have much time." Claire's chest tightened. "Is he going to make it?" The woman hesitated, then met Claire's eyes. "He's a fighter. He wouldn't have lasted this long if he wasn't." Those words gave Claire a small flicker of hope. She stepped back, watching as they carefully lifted Milo onto a stretcher. His body barely moved, but for the first time he wasn't bound by chains. As they loaded him into the animal control van, Claire felt a strange ache in her chest. She had only known Milo for a few hours, yet somehow it felt like she had always been meant to find him. "Do you want to follow us to the shelter?" the worker asked, his voice pulling Claire from her thoughts. "Yes," she said immediately. She didn't even have to think about it. The vet's office smelled of antiseptic and fresh linen. The fluorescent lights were too bright against the late-night darkness. Claire sat in the waiting room, her hands gripping the edges of her jacket, as she watched the door to the exam room. The minutes dragged on. Finally the door opened, and the veterinarian stepped out, pulling off his gloves. "How is he? Is he stable?" Claire jumped to her feet. "We got him on fluids, cleaned his wounds, and started him on antibiotics. He's severely malnourished, but the good news is we got to him in time." Claire exhaled shakily, a wave of relief washing over her. The vet studied her for a moment before tilting his head. "You care about him a lot, don't you?" Claire hesitated. She wasn't sure how to explain it. I couldn't leave him there," she finally said. "No one else ever noticed him, but—" "I did." The vet gave her a small smile. "Well, you saved his life." Claire swallowed the lump in her throat. "Can I see him?" He nodded. "He's resting now, but you can go in." The sight of Milo lying on a soft blanket instead of cold dirt nearly broke her all over again. His body looked even smaller under the fluorescent lights, but his breathing was steadier. An IV was hooked to his front leg, and his ears twitched at the sound of her footsteps. She knelt beside him, reaching out to brush her fingers gently against his paw. "Hey, buddy," she whispered. "You did it." His eyes opened just a little, and then his tail moved just a tiny flick. Barely anything, but enough to tell her that for the first time in a long time, he believed he was safe. Claire smiled through the tears stinging her eyes. For the first time, Milo was finally free. His recovery was slow, but every day brought a small sign of progress. For the first few days, he barely moved. He spent most of his time curled up in his blanket at the shelter, his body still too weak to do much else. The veterinarians monitored his health closely, making sure he was eating, staying hydrated, and regaining his strength. Claire visited him every day. At first, he barely reacted. He would lift his head slightly when she spoke, his ears twitching at the sound of her voice. But he never tried to stand, never showed much energy. Still, she never stopped coming. She would sit beside him for hours, talking softly, letting him get used to her presence. She told him about her day, about how much she wished she could take him outside, about how the world wasn't as cruel as the one he had known. And then, one afternoon, everything changed. Claire had just walked into his room when she saw something different. Milo was standing. His legs were shaky, his movements slow, but he was on his feet. Her heart swelled. "Look at you," she whispered, stepping closer. Milo took one small step forward, then another. His eyes met hers, and for the first time there was something in them that hadn't been there before. Trust. Claire swallowed back the lump in her throat. "You're doing so good, buddy," she said. Milo wagged his tail. It was weak, barely more than a twitch, but it was the first true sign that he was healing, not just physically, but emotionally. Claire sank to her knees, reaching out carefully. This time, Milo moved toward her. He pressed his head against her palm, his body warm beneath her touch. Tears burned behind her eyes as she stroked his fur, feeling the slow rise and fall of his breath. For so long, Milo had been nothing more than a shadow in someone's backyard, a forgotten soul. But now he was alive. The shelter workers had started discussing Milo's future. He was improving, but he still needed a home, someone patient, someone willing to help him adjust after everything he had been through. Claire knew what they were hinting at. They were asking if she would take him. She had spent every moment with him since his rescue. She had been the first person to see him, the first person to show him kindness. And now she had a choice to make. Was she ready? Could she give him the life he deserved? Claire sat in the shelter office, her mind racing as she filled out the adoption paperwork. She already knew the answer. Milo belonged with her, and soon he would finally be home. The day had finally arrived. Claire stood in the shelter lobby, her heart pounding as she gripped the leash in her hands. She had signed the adoption papers that morning. There was no turning back now, not that she ever would. Milo was hers. A worker led him out of the back room, and Claire felt a lump form in her throat as she saw him. He looked so different from the dog she had found that day behind the fence. He was still thin, his ribs still faintly visible beneath his fur, but he was stronger now. His legs no longer shook with every step, and his coat had started to regain its shine. But the biggest change wasn't physical. It was in his eyes. That haunting emptiness, the deep sadness that had once consumed him, was fading, and in its place was something new. Hope. Claire crouched down as Milo walked toward her, his tail wagging. Not just a small flick like before, but a real, full wag. She let out a shaky laugh, blinking back tears. "Hey, buddy, you ready?" Milo pressed his nose into her shoulder. Claire's chest tightened. He wasn't just ready, he was home. Claire opened the car door, watching as Milo hesitated. He had never known what it was like to ride in a car. He had never experienced the excitement that most dogs had, sticking, their heads out the window, feeling the wind in their fur. She knelt beside him, speaking softly. "It's okay. I'll be right here." Milo looked at her, then at the open door, and then he stepped inside. Claire smiled as she moved to the driver's seat. She started the engine and glanced at him through the rearview mirror. He was sitting still, unsure, but his eyes remained calm. "You're doing great," she murmured as she pulled onto the road. Something incredible happened. Milo turned his head toward the window, and for the first time in his life, he watched the world move, the trees, the houses, the people walking down the street. It was all new to him. He had spent so many years staring at the same backyard, the same fence, the same patch of dirt. But now the world was his. Claire led Milo inside, watching as he sniffed the air. Her apartment was small but cozy. A soft dog bed sat by the couch, and a bowl of fresh water was waiting for him in the kitchen. She had bought him toys, but she wasn't sure if he even knew how to play. Milo took slow steps across the floor, his paws clicking softly against the hardwood. Claire sat down, giving him space to explore. He sniffed the couch, the rug, the walls. Then he turned and walked straight to her. Without hesitation, he curled up at her feet. Claire's throat tightened. "You really trust me, huh?" she whispered. Milo lifted his head and pressed his nose into her palm. Claire stroked his fur, feeling the warmth of his body against her legs. "You're home, Milo," she murmured. "Forever." He let out a deep, contented sigh. For the first time in his life, he belonged, and for the first time he fell asleep, feeling safe. Milo was unrecognizable. His ribs were no longer visible. His fur had grown back thick and soft, and his eyes were full of life. Every morning he waited by the door, his tail wagging excitedly for his walk. Every night he curled up beside Claire on the couch, pressing his head against her lap as she stroked his fur. He had gone from being a forgotten, broken soul in a backyard to a loved and cherished part of a family. Claire often thought about the day she had found him, how many people had walked past that fence, never stopping. She was grateful she had. Milo had saved her as much as she had saved him, because love, real, unconditional love, had healed them both. Milo's journey from neglect to love is proof that second chances change lives, not just for dogs, but for the people who saved them. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with someone who believes in rescue and redemption. Every animal deserves a home. Be the reason a life changes today.